Hello, everybody. My name's Daniel, and I'm in recovery for pornography addiction, and happy to be sharing today. So my topic is honest encounters, and what I've been thinking on is how we bring ourselves to God and how we engage with our higher power. I'll be reading a bit from the big book and the good book, the Bible, specifically the book of Luke. One of the first things that I have written in my big book, the big book Awakening Process, had me write right on the first page and from the cover, a prayer. And it says, God, please enable me to set aside everything that I think I know for an open mind and a new experience. And then depending on what I'm working through, help me see the truth about, and then depending what the thing is, you would pray. But I love that it's inviting God into the process to set aside everything I think I know for an open mind and a new experience. And to me, I've been a Christian like my whole life, and also for a way higher percentage of my life than I would care to admit, I've also been a person with an addiction problem. And those two things were kind of, incongruent, right? On one hand, my understanding of faith was to be good, to live in a sort of like spiritual place, happiness sort of experience. And then on the other hand, I had a way more up and down experience of emotions and guilt and shame. And I didn't know how to bridge those together. But as I was taken through the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, subbing in my language rather than addiction to alcohol, I'd put lust or pornography or something like that to have it tell my story. I started to realize that my connection to my higher power was essential. Really, my recovery and my freedom would rise and fall on that. And, that's where but I'm a Christian, so I've got that covered, right? And the answer was no. There was so much I didn't know about God. Specifically, there's so much I didn't have like real connection. I actually knew a lot, but self-knowledge or even knowledge about God doesn't really help. It's really connection that matters. And so that's what brings me to this topic, that how do we come into connection with our higher power, with God, and not just have head knowledge that doesn't really help. And so essentially, here's right near the beginning in Bill's story, the first chapter. So page 12 of the big book, there's two sections with italics. They don't happen a lot, and they're pretty important when they're in italics. And this character, Bill, is a person in the throes of addiction whose friend comes to visit him to pass on the message of hope, that there can be freedom, and it comes through a connection to God. And Bill's reflecting like what he thinks about God, how he doesn't believe in God. And then his friend puts in a suggestion. Here it says, my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, italics, why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last, and another little italics thing. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. And I thought that was, the first time I heard that, I was at a Jericho Road, like Tuesday morning Bible study at Jack Purcell. I think, I heard it, I didn't really make the connection, but I was like, there's an openness, to let God in, rather than me have a box that God has to fit through. Rather, I need to just come, and there's a way wider avenue towards the higher power of the universe than what my little tight confines were. And so what does that mean for my encounter with God, or coming to God honestly? I guess it's that I can come to God not fitting a box that I had kind of made up. Previously, I was like, God has to be, there's this scripture that says like, He deserves to be worshiped with happy voices. And that's really true. Sure, God deserves like a joyful response. But I had kind of started to internalize this idea that my encounters with God had to be like a squeaky clean, for lack of like a better image. Like I had to be good and come to God with my goodness. There's some really good things about seeing the reverence of God and being like kind of in awe. And like, I put on a nice shirt because when I'm going to meet someone important, I try and, honor that experience. But that started to get internalized into, I had to be good to come into the presence of God. Now that kind of encounter with God wasn't honest to my experience. It was a conception that wasn't actually furthering my relationship. And I needed ways to connect to my higher power that would actually let me come with my whole self and my whole experience. Otherwise, the addict Daniel got left outside. And then the refined version came inside the church and then left to reconnect to my garbage that I left on the sidewalk. Right? That's not a path to the power that my higher power wants to bring into my life. So I've got one other big book passage, and then I'm going to actually look at a few different examples of honest encounters with God that are modeled in the book of Luke. And that maybe for you will be like, oh yeah, maybe I need to be free to encounter God in XYZ way. And my hope is that it'll open up, different examples of how we can engage with God, however we're feeling, rather than cutting that part out. But first, chapter We Agnostics, I think it's 3, is talking all about this. They're wrestling with like, who is God? Who is our higher power? Can I believe in that? What does that look like? And on page 55, I'm going to look at paragraph 3 and maybe 4. Here's a reflection from the people who have been in recovery. It says, we finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality, capital G, capital R, deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he, God, may be found. It was so with us. That's our experience. And then the next paragraph clarifies that a bit. It says, we can only clear the ground a bit. I can only, your pace setter, your mentor can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then, if you wish, you can join us on this broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief or the reality of the higher power is sure to come to you. I like some of the language in there, like clearing the ground. Sometimes it's just making the way clear. What matters most is that I have an honest experience to God, not that someone forces me how to encounter God. That's the whole point of the 2 things I read, that it's not like a really narrow, it has to look this way because this is how it looked to me. Or it can only be like, you can only encounter your higher power if you're crying. Or it only counts as a higher power experience if you're laughing. Those sort of narrowing things does not enable us to think honestly or encourage us to like reflect deeply. I think that is where, for me, maybe my connection to God actually really deepened to a personal connection to the power, rather than just thinking I understood how it worked, which, like I said, understanding how it works doesn't do that much. Okay, so we want to clear the ground. We want to have an honest thought, and we want to search fearlessly within ourselves. That's where the change happens at the end of the day. And if you're like me, I just mentioned, there's sometimes you get caught in a few ways to approach God. Sometimes that comes from, the community of faith you grew up in and you just saw modeled a certain way. Maybe you had a really impactful leader, and they were someone who was super enthusiastic, and when they were encountering God, they modeled a certain way. And then that's like, oh, that's how you do it. And instead of recognizing that they're modeling one way of encountering the higher power of God, it became like in my brain, oh, that's the right way. Thankfully, alongside the big book, which is just said, there's so many, it's broad, it's roomy, and that God is going to reveal himself. He's not limited by us. Likewise to the big book, the good book, the Bible. Specifically, I'm going to look at the gospel account, the story of Jesus's life that the author Luke captures, and choose just a few people who I think reflect a few different ways to come. And so sometimes our experience leads us to have a different emotional landscape inside. Sometimes I'm in a place where I've got just a lot of one feeling, or something has happened that's it's the predominant emotional experience I'm having. To honestly encounter God, I need to be able to bring that to God. Parking it on the side or trying to make it less important. Sometimes you have to do that to deal with something. Like if I'm having a really sad day and my baby starts crying, I'm not going to be like, oh, poor little old me. Let me deal with myself first. I can put my sadness or tiredness on the side and engage with the thing that matters. Sometimes that is a normal relational thing. But when it comes to God, God doesn't want us to segment ourselves. He wants us to respond to what's going on inside. Here's an example. I'm going to choose 4 or 5 different people and then talk about those. So I open it up to the beginning of Luke. Here's the second chapter. We got showcased a character here. So this is right at the beginning. Jesus is a little baby. And his parents bring him to the temple, the religious center, to do what their traditions ask them to do, commit the baby to God. And there's a character who meets them. There was a prophet, Anna. She was very old. She had lived with her husband, there's some backstory, 7 years, and then she was a widow until she was now 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. And coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. So we got a character here. Her experience is really, really passionate. She's I think John jokes a lot about how his mother, Nan, or Colleen, Ruby, is just praying for people all the time. This person models a life of prayer that's super focused on interceding or engaging with people. And what does it look like in her life? Well, what prayer looks like to her, connecting to God. She never left the temple. It's that's her main place. For her, connecting to God revolves around this super devotion to a place where she worships night and day. She's a pretty full-time person, but what she does, worshipped, she fasts, and she she prays. And so what prayer and connecting to higher power looks like for this woman, she focuses on, or at least she's modeling to us, intercession. And there might be seasons where for us to grow in our recovery and to connect deeper to God, we might need to adopt intercession as the focal point, the main style of prayer that we're doing for a season. And you can look at the story of Anna and be she's an intercession superstar. She's been, doing this for years, it looks like. And maybe for my life, if I'm going to deepen my understanding of intercession, I can take some cues from her. Making myself present to a place of worship, finding those places where I can worship, whatever that looks like for you, if it's singing with people or if it's just going out on a walk, but the focus on worshiping and praying. Intercession might be a style that you don't know, and that's oh wow, so inspiring. And she gets to share some really good news out of it. I'm going to jump forward a little bit to another example of a character whose prayer style is a little different. In chapter 10, right at the end of the chapter, we get to a kind of famous duo. I'm going to read it. Verse 38, the end of chapter 10. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. And then there's a little kerfuffle. Martha is upset that she's not helping. And then Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you were worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen that, and it will not be taken away from her. So what does Mary's connection to the higher power look like? For her, I would call it, so Anna was like focused on intercession. I think Mary is focused on personal devotion. Like her big focus, we don't see fasting, we don't see prayer, we don't see worship. We just see like her doing everything she can to get at the feet of Jesus, just that proximity. I think like she's listening, she's putting aside the to-dos for a time. I'm sure she's helpful at other times around the house. Like she's not neglecting her sister all the time. But in this case, we see her highlighting kind of the connection to God of just personal devotion. And I think that one, honestly, is really relevant to me. I think in this season, I've been like struggling a lot to make the time. Like if I really valued it and I chose the better thing, chose that like closeness to God, my time would reflect it. And that's something I'm working on. And personal devotion is a place where I guess Mary just gets to feel the love of God and hear the voice of God and live out of that. And I think that despite her not making dinner or vacuuming, whatever they did back then, that she was actually able to go from that place of intimacy and then be a more effective spreader of the message because she heard it like firsthand. So Anna, she was an example of intercession as a way of connecting. Mary is an example of just like personal devotion to time and closeness. I'll flip it a little close to the end. We're getting to the end of the book, Luke 18. Yeah, here's one. It's verse 9. So here's a little showdown that Jesus gives a commentary on. Some were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. So Jesus told this parable. An example, 2 men went to the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee religious leader, and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus goes on to say the value that this guy has. This tax collector has a posture of like confession. Sometimes our connection to our higher power really needs to camp out there. For me to see myself rightly, I need to just say, you know, I've done X, Y, Z. Help me to stay humble. Help me to stay like aware of my need for you. Obviously, we shouldn't stay there only, just like we shouldn't only stay in like the other ways of connecting to God. But sometimes we need to be in the place of confession because it does something really good for our hearts. Well, the result here, Jesus says, like, I tell you that this man went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. If I switch the idea of that a little bit to my recovery journey, I think that's exactly what I want. I want to humble myself and recognize that I don't have all the power on my own, and that I need to do the practice of saying I'm powerless by my own, but that's the way to actually receiving power, being exalted like Jesus says. So you get some example of connecting to God via intercession, personal devotion, or confession. And I chose this one because it's about the Jericho Road. Verse 35 of that same chapter, 18. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening, and they told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. So he yelled out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the group by rebuked him and told him to be quiet. Shh. But he shouted only more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped, ordered the man to be brought to him. And when he came near, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord, I want to see," he replied. And Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight, your faith has healed him." So this guy, I chose to say, is an example of petition, meaning he knew what he wanted from God and he asked for it. And when he was told to quiet down, he asked for it even louder. He shows something about a relationship to God that I definitely need to hear. Even when some people rebuke him and say, no, it's not how you connect to God. First of all, don't be blind. Second of all, don't be loud, right? He says, no, that's not what I believe about God. I'm gonna just yell until I get his attention because I know he's got the power that I need. So sometimes I need to reflect on that because it looks like this guy's petitioning of God to get what he needs in his life is a lot bolder than my idea of petitioning God. And he gets a miraculous healing, right? Like his connection to God is like exactly what I want. And so maybe for us, we need to camp out and think, what does it look like for me to take that level of petition to practice? And maybe it means being a little louder, whether it's in your own prayer life or you're at church and someone says, "Hey, we're going to just pray for healing. Does anyone want healing?" And I look around the room, in my experience, and be like, "Yeah, kind of, but not enough to put my hand up." This guy would have put his hand up and his jumped up and ran to the front while he was at it. And I think that shows an openness that let something really big happen in his life. Connecting to God, using the example of this Jericho Road guy, his petition might be a way of honestly coming to God. That might be what we need to be honest to ourselves and to God for something to happen. And the last one I was going to read, I'll just summarize. There's a story right at the end, in the last chapter, where some people go away really disheartened because Jesus is dead, and they thought, "Oh, it was all not real. I got sucked into this, and now there's nothing left. Jesus is dead. It wasn't real," and they're sad. But they actually have an encounter with God in that place, and their response is they've hiked 11 miles or something. They've walked really far. And it's dinner and it's dark. They're like, "Okay, we're done. We're defeated." And they encounter Jesus. He shows up to them and reveals to them something true, that he's alive, that he has power, that he is really the king of the world. And what their response is jubilation. I chose all ins: intercession, devotion, confession, petition, and jubilation. Their response is super thankfulness. And they literally run back 11 miles, find the other believers, and they just tell them what they've seen and heard and experienced. And they're not going to let tiredness hold them back. They're not going to let social norms hold them back, even danger hold them back. Their jubilation, their celebration, is just the honest outflow of how they're connecting to God at that time. And they could have put it off and said, "Oh, we'll go in the morning." It will still be just as true in the morning. But the thing that was most honest to them was to go right then, to not hold back. And I think that was the outflowing of their connection to God at that point. So in summary, there are a lot more ways to connect with our higher power than maybe we've seen from one person or one source. And I hope that you can come to the Bible and see characters and resonate with them and be like, "Oh, their way of connection, or the thing that they're really holding on to right now, is what I need to hold on to right now as well." And then you can just meditate on their lived experience, and then let yourself explore maybe a different way of connecting to God, because that's what the big book wants us to do. That's what Jesus, or the higher power as represented in the Bible, wants us to do. Is to have our whole self brought into connection to God, and to not cut out certain emotions, but bring those to God, and let him, work through them and bring us into that fourth dimension, that spiritual dimension, where we want to live out of. That's where our spirits wants to live out of. So that is my reflection for today. And I'm sure that you all have way more examples that you have got inspiration out of the Bible or out of other people and how they've taught you to engage with your higher power. And so I hope maybe even to hear that from you, and we can encourage each other in our ongoing recovery and connection to God. So thanks so much for letting me share today.